Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special online edition of Global Voices. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce to you a new voice that many of you may not be aware of, and someone who I've come to know and respect, a voice that I believe will be beneficial for those of you who want to know missiology and want to know what's going on around the world of missions, especially as it relates to North America. This is Daniel Yang. Daniel Yang is the director of the Church Multiplication Institute at Wheaton College, and he has earned an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He has gone to the University of Michigan, which is why he's a big Tom Brady fan. We weren't planning on talking about that, but I won't be surprised if he throws that in there. And he is now working on a PhD in intercultural studies at Trinity Evangelical. Thank you for joining us today, Daniel Yang.
Hey, David, thanks for having me. Really good to be on with you.
All right. So let's just start. Just tell us about your background. Where did you grow up? What did you enjoy doing as a kid? And how did you become a Christian?
Yeah. So my parents immigrated to the United States in 1979 from Laos via refugee camps in Thailand. And so ethnically, I'm Hmong. We all are familiar with the war that was being fought in Vietnam. There was one simultaneously being fought in Laos. Later, it was renamed the Secret War in Laos. So my dad and others were a part of guerrilla units that were trained and recruited by the CIA to assist in fighting against the communists in Laos there. So when my family ended up being refugee immigrants, they immigrated to the United States in 1979, where I was born. 6 months later, or I should say my mom was 6 months pregnant with me when we arrived to the United States. So I was born outside of Chicago, about 2 hours in an area called the Quad Cities. But I grew up most of my childhood and young adult life in Detroit. So if you all have seen the movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood, it's a rated R movie, so I'm not necessarily promoting it, but if you wanted to know how I grew
We'll
up.
cut that part out of this recording here. It's okay.
But if you want to know how I grew up, that reflects, kind of Hollywood's version of how I grew up, inner city, predominantly African-American neighborhood. And so we were, the immigrants in the inner city. And so I did all my grade school years in the Detroit public school system there, and then earned a full ride scholarship to the University of Michigan, as you had mentioned, and where Tom Brady was still a second, third string quarterback my freshman year. Eventually,
Oh yeah, so you got to actually watch him then.
Yep, overlapped 2 years with him. And I studied computer science, so I was an engineer for 9 years before vocational ministry, full-time vocational ministry. But growing up as a kid, growing up in inner city, I think a lot of my experiences were really, number one, it was during the height of gang activity, and so this would have been the 90s, and so the gang activity was just really in its heyday, and so surviving was.
And you're not just talking about the Detroit Pistons, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why they were called the Bad Boys, because it was reflective of how the perception of the United States had about Detroit at the time. And I mean, that's a little bit of my own narrative as well, is, being a refugee immigrant kid growing up in, inner city America. But yeah, I should say though, I was involved in my local church, which it was predominantly Hmong. It was an immigrant church that was in Detroit. And so and my joke is, between Guns N' Roses and my youth group, that's what saved me from gangs. So Guns N' Roses introduced me to music and guitar, and I learned to eventually lead worship, and I did that most of my years at the church there. So, yeah, so that was kind of my early upbringing, David.
All right. Well, so tell me just a little bit more about your youth group experience and just those years of living as a Christian. First of all, just how it related to living in that culture there. We'll talk about the other question I already mentioned, but
Yeah.
what was it like being a Christian and being different in that particular culture?
Yeah, what's interesting is that so Hmong people, specifically those from Laos, which is my family, there are at least 4 to 10 million Hmong people in the in the world, and depending on how you define Hmong, it's lesser or more than that. Majority of them living in China, and some of them living in Laos. So those who were from Laos that were Hmong, they were only one generation into becoming Christians, and so the first Christian known in Laos was 1950. Our family, my dad became the first believer in the lineage of our family. So at the age of 41, he became a follower of Jesus after living a lifetime of, in a sense, shamanistic, animistic worldview, folk religion. And although I felt like I had a pretty kind of normal Christian upbringing, you can imagine my dad being midlife before he became a believer of Jesus. It was a big transition,
Wow.
a huge. I would say I wouldn't say like a rift, but there was definitely tension between my father's family and the rest of our extended family, because we were Christians, whereas they were not. So in a lot of ways, for immigrant churches, specifically for the Hmong, the church became not just, a religious place. It was your social life. It was your network,
Mhm.
especially for those of us who, in some ways, in becoming Christian, we had to leave some family commitments behind. You hear this about
Yeah.
Muslims quite a bit around the world. And so it's also true for some Hmong people. And so the church really became not just a religious institution for a lot of us, but it was also, our socially, where we had relationships, where we found belonging. And so the combination of being new immigrants and then also newly converted to following Jesus, the church became like that social institution for a lot of us.
Mhm.
And so my youth group, I kind of jokingly say it saved me from gangs, because that was the tension for a lot of immigrants in the inner city, who they were feeling a lot of pressure from majority groups, and either conforming, but usually not conforming, usually kind of being marginalized, or in a lot, as a kid, being threatened of being beaten up. You would either assimilate into gang culture in order to protect yourself, and then there was some of us who kind of went, and the church became that place for us. And I would say, David, as I kind of reflect back, now that as a missiologist, now that understanding a little bit more of social theory, I understood that the church wasn't just a place where faith-based activities happened. It was the place where I think many of us, second generation specifically, we were being like integrated into American society, and what does it mean to belong as an American, and what does it mean to identify as an American? And so we were working a lot of those things out in our local churches. So youth group, we had the typical, youth group conferences, youth retreats, all of those things. But that was very formative for many of us in asking the question, who are we, not just as Christians, but who are we as Americans?
So, how did being Hmong, being a minority, impact you as you are making your way in what is essentially a majority white evangelical culture?
Man, that's a really interesting question, David, because I think I'm still asking what that question means. And so let me explain why. I spent, I would say, probably the first 29 years, let's say the first 30 years of my life in a predominantly immigrant Hmong church. And early on, when my dad was a believer, we kind of bounced around smaller Southern Baptist churches, a Lutheran church. But by the time I was like 5 or 6, my dad helped to plant a Hmong church that was Christian Missionary Alliance. So in a sense, I grew up 25
I didn't know
years,
that. That's interesting. That's
yeah,
really good. Yeah.
in Christian Missionary Alliance churches specifically that were Hmong, and they were planted with an evangelistic focus, but they were also planted because these were existing Christians, newly immigrated, and they were forming faith communities. And so that was my experience for, the first 3 decades of my life. And so when I came on staff at a predominantly white church in South Lake, Texas, out of all places. So let me tell you, South Lake, Texas is not inner city Detroit. It's probably the complete opposite. I had neighbors that were Texas Rangers, baseball players, sorry. And Dallas Cowboys, so it was very different. Kerry Jobe lived down the street from me, so it was very different from my upbringing. And so it was a complete immersion into what some folks would call like white evangelicalism. And I grew up in Detroit, and so it was very different. And my mentor, who's still a very close friend of mine, his name is Bob Roberts Jr. I remember us having lunch one time, and I was just sharing with him some of my insecurities about how being a person who, his parents are immigrants and essentially I've always been the minority in the room, how I felt nervous about, could I contribute to predominantly white evangelical spaces, which, mind you, David, I don't think I ever had a dream that one day I would like be a missiologist and work at a predominantly white evangelical institution. But Bob said something that was really profound to me, and it really became a framework for the way that I think about myself. And he said to me, he said, Daniel, stop thinking like a minority. And he wasn't being condescending, but what he was saying was, don't just look at yourself as specifically a minority. And then he said, think of yourself as a global citizen. And that really helped me see in some ways what I've initially thought might have been a disadvantage. It really became like, hey, you've actually been given this amazing advantage in that, like, you have this two worldview system that you can kind of go in and out of. Now, that didn't solve a lot of like internal tensions sometimes that I do feel, because a lot of the conversation around, especially when we talk about the American church, it's predominantly framed around like the history of the church in America, which for a long time has been predominantly white. And so, case in point, when Rick Warren planted Saddleback Church in 1980, that was the year after I was born. America was still roughly 85% white. And in about 14 to 20 years, America will be less than 50% white for the first time. And so for me, a lot of it has been asking the question, what does it mean for Christians from around the world to be here in America and to participate meaningfully and to be a part of the American church, and I think that has been predominantly some of the narrative that's framing, how I exist in these spaces these days, because I do think the Lord is doing something. 1 in 4 immigrants that come to the United States are already Christian.
Right.
Stephen Warner, he's a sociologist out of the University of Chicago, and he wrote this back in 2004. He said that immigration isn't the de-Christianization of America, it's the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. And so it's really interesting to see myself as kind of like a part of that. And I think it means something. If you look at mainline Protestant Christianity, it's been steeply declining for the last several decades. I mean, you just see this huge drop off from mainline Christianity, Protestantism. But when you look at evangelicalism, there is a slight decline. It's not steep. It's just kind of subtle.
Right.
But what's kept it from like a steep decline has been the immigrant church. It's been Christians that come here from all over the world. So I see myself like as a part of that story.
Well, you are, you're evidence of God working among the immigrant community to help reach and make disciples in North America. And so that is something we'll talk a little bit more about in regards to your book. But I wanted to just make mention of your time in Toronto, where you did church planning there. Yeah, tell us a little bit about your time in Toronto. What was the most encouraging thing you saw most encouraging thing you saw God do while you were there?
Yeah, I mentioned my time with Bob Roberts Jr. in Fort Worth, Texas. There, and so he was our sending church, sent us out to plant churches in Toronto. Part of the reason why we ended up in Toronto was, again, it was me trying to understand like my social narrative as being an child of immigrants in predominantly urban spaces. And Toronto, in case folks don't know, Toronto is the most ethnically diverse city in the world. 51% of Toronto residents are born outside of Canada. And so I really felt like maybe in some ways I was born for a city like Toronto. And so when we started looking for cities to plant churches, Toronto was at the very top. And I remember we were doing a vision trip there, my wife and I and a few others. And we were talking to one of the other church planters that had come up from, I believe, Mississippi at the time. And one of the spouses, she was talking about how difficult it was to adjust to like some of the, in her words, the ethnic cuisine in Toronto. And she said that was, it sounds like a pretty typical missionary story,
Right.
Mind you, I mean, Toronto is very, very North American, right? And so she was talking about her struggles. And I remember my wife, Linda, looking over at me. She's like, that doesn't sound like a struggle or tension to me. I feel like
No,
that's a
no.
dream to be,
Yeah. So I'm from Alabama, and
Yeah.
if I'm in my mid-20s, then that may be an adjustment, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
after living in Asia, that sounds amazing.
Amazing. Yeah, exactly.
That,
And
yeah.
it was kind of at that moment where it was like, wow, we were made for like a city like Toronto. And so we spent 5 years there. We planted a church in downtown Toronto with an amazing couple, Mike and Missy Seaman. The church is called Trinity Life Church. Very multi-ethnic. We had never had to use that identifier. We're a multi-ethnic church. It was just kind of the nature of who we were and the kinds of people that we were reaching. And then we planted 3 churches out of that church. And, it was amazing. And you and I have a mutual friend that you eventually connected to us.
Yeah. So this is a story we have to tell,
Yeah, yeah.
which is really it's the main reason we connected.
Mhm.
We are in Birmingham, Alabama, at the president of Samford University's mansion. It's the week of the Southern Baptist Convention, and we just happen to be sitting on opposite sides of the table. We're talking about where I lived in Southeast Asia. I can't remember why I mentioned this, but at one point I talked about how we were fortunate to see God work among some Iranian students where we were, and you asked a question that floored me. You said, "Do you know?" And then you came out with the name of a particular Iranian, and I just shook my head. So, yeah, I know him. How do you know him? And you said, I baptized him. Which is just so incredible
Yeah.
that we wound up on opposite sides of the table, because this young man had been in our ministry for years. He did not become a Christian while in Southeast Asia. And I can't remember if I told you this part, but when I found out that he had become a believer, he was already living in Toronto. And it wasn't through him, it was through a friend of mine, Brian Pitts, who had been making trips. He spent a couple summers with us in Southeast Asia, but he was just really faithful in keeping up with him. And so when our mutual friend becomes a believer, he lets Brian know. And Brian tells me, I'm real excited. I'm like, that's awesome. Why did he tell you first? I'm the one that lived there. And so the whole thing is just how God is in control. He uses this person and that person, and then how incredible that you were able to be there to reap the harvest of that one.
And part of we want him to have the agency of telling his own story. So that part of the hesitancy to even say his name and give all the details is to honor and respect his agency in that. But understanding his story and being able to be just a link in the chain of what God is doing. I mean, this is global Christianity, right? Like we used to say it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes the world to raise global Christians. And again, going back to the statement that Bob Roberts made to me, that you're a global citizen. Like in some ways, that's the new reality that ministry is coming out of. And so,
I mean, this story, white guy from Alabama moves to Southeast Asia, meets an Iranian who's an international student
Mhm.
there, sows some seeds for a while. Iranian moves to Canada, where a man who is among American who'd immigrated to the U.S. then moves across the border to reap that harvest. That's pretty incredible,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's a great story, and we
Mhm.
still are in touch. And he's, married now and Canadian, and so. But it's again, I mean, though that was in some ways part of the compelling narrative of what it meant that global Christianity is happening. It's the interconnection between here and over there, and how there's full circle moments like that. And I feel like that's the new imagination for understanding mission. It's not so much just like us going over there, but there is a them coming over here. And it used to be, David, that when Christians would say, the nations are coming here to America so that we can reach them, like that's a true statement. That's not like untrue. But there's also a sense in which like the nations are coming here to North America to reach North Americans as well. And I think that's a dynamic that we should acknowledge, and we should also very much missiologically like try to unpack and understand.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your book, I'm going to go ahead and get into Inalienable, which is a book you co-authored with Matthew Sorens. Um, and I forgot the other
Eric
author,
Costanza.
Costanza. And so you point to something that's happening in Europe as a bit of a source of hope, whereas typically when we think about the church in Europe, we think of it as a cautionary tale. But there are things that have been brought out by you for a couple of decades now with people like Philip Jenkins.
Mhm.
What is it that you were talking about there that should give us a little bit of hope?
Yeah, so to see and feel free to chime in, David, if I'm not heading in the right direction. But a part of the story of Europe oftentimes is told in terms of the decline of the church.
Right.
And in some ways, Pew Research actually this week came out with a similar article that talked about how Christianity in America is declining, and their projection is by 2070, America will be less than 50% Christian, and that's for the first time in history of the United States. And so the decline narrative has been like driving a lot of what we would say, missions to the West, churches in decline. Um, and yet, as we're looking to, what's happening in Europe, and specifically in like English-speaking Europe, but what we would consider to be like Western Europe, some of the things that we're also seeing here in the United States is how the immigrant church, and I can, right off the top of my head, like the Nigerian church, or Christians from Nigeria, Christians from Ethiopia, Christians from India, and other parts of South Asia, how in some ways they're having a direct impact on not just church numbers, but church leadership, those who are integrated into the leadership of the churches. We would say this about the American church, and I mean, there are denominations in America where their orthodoxy is being maintained not by Americans in America, but by Africans in Africa, insisting on Americans maintaining Orthodox theology in their denomination. And
And
so,
through my seminary at Beeson Divinity School, we kind of have a front row seat for some of this
Mhm,
because we have people from various denominations. And so I've seen what you're talking about within Anglicanism,
mhm.
and definitely with the a global Methodist movement, where
Methodist.
our brothers and sisters in Africa have been much more faithful in terms of simply staying with the word, even when it is difficult.
That's right.
Mm.
And those are huge. I would say these are uh, anchor points in parts of Europe, and we're seeing that also in North America. that again is a reminder that like I said this earlier, it is a bit like a full circle thing. There's a movie, David, called The Arrival. Have you seen this movie?
Oh yeah,
And
I know what you're talking about, yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna give it away, just like a
Spoiler
preacher
alert.
would. Yeah, spoiler alert. But it's a movie about aliens that come to Earth, and they actually they come in these pods, and it's mysterious at first, but over time they teach this language to humans, and it's over this span of maybe a couple of years or so that humans learn to, and the language isn't verbal, or it's more like you learn shapes, and the shapes actually create dreams. That's really kind of a weird, vague way to explain it. But essentially, the humans get to this point where they know enough of the language to ask the aliens, why did you come here and why did you teach us how to communicate with you? And the aliens say to the humans, 3,000, we're from the future, 3,000 years from now, we are going to face extinction, and you humans are going to be the ones to help us overcome that threat. And in the same way, like Western Christianity for hundreds of years, through various different means, was a part of bringing the gospel to certain continents and certain parts of the world. And in some ways, like those parts of the world are returning the favor now. And, those believers all around the world are now occupying spaces in the Western Hemisphere, in a sense, returning with the gospel to the places where they once received it from. And I think that in a lot of ways, that is Jesus making this like huge global connection point around the world, and saying that like global Christianity isn't about what's happening just over there, in some remote part of the world. It's like it's the activity of what God is doing around the world in the interconnection that we're all experiencing right now.
Okay, so we are getting short on time. Give us maybe one more thing about inalienable that would kind of whet our appetite, want people to go check it out.
Yeah, when Eric and Matt and I worked on this book, now Matt Sorens, he works in advocacy for World Relief, an amazing organization. And then Eric Costanzo is a pastor of South Tulsa Baptist Church in Tulsa. And I direct the Church Multiplication Institute. And we wrote this book because we saw the discouragement and the disenfranchisement of young Christians here in America, and how they were processing some of the polarities that we see, not just in American politics, but also just in the American church. And we were trying to just mine the stories of young people and why they were disenfranchised and sometimes even leaving the Christian faith altogether. And there is a part of us where, I mean, we were affirming that, there are reasons for why they were citing leaving the church. They were valid. But we also found that a lot of the reasons why they were leaving the church was because the church wasn't being the church. The church was, it was not acting according to Jesus. And what we wanted young Christians and their friends to really know and understand is that there is no, and they probably know this, there's no perfect version of the church ever in history and ever in the world. But our conflation of the American church with the kingdom of God is not like, we have to be careful when we do that. And so having an understanding of the ancient church, having an understanding of the church from around the world, and how that's different from the American church can give some people some clarity as they're sorting through their disorientation and disenfranchisement. And that's really what we're doing. And we really do think that these voices, what we call marginalized voices, are really a part of what's kind of whispering to a segment in the American church, what's kind of keeping them going, and what's actually exciting them for the work of the kingdom of God in the world. And so I just, last thing is, I really hope and pray that, as young Christian leaders and as young people of faith, that we get excited about the kingdom of God, especially when we feel discouraged about what we see happening in some parts of American Christianity.
Thanks, Daniel. How can people keep up with your work?
Yeah, you can find us at it's a bit long, but it's Wheaton Billy Graham Center.org, and my institute will be listed there. And or you can Google Church Multiplication Institute, and you can find a lot of our research there.
And I'm assuming people can follow you on Twitter. It's
Oh, that's right. Yep, you can follow me on Twitter at KOOB as in boy XWM. That's my Hmong name, Gongsu.
all
KOOB.
right. I did not realize that. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, David.